Welcome to our discussion on muted group theory. This theory is going to give us a little bit different perspective than some of the other ones that we have talked through. It falls under the category of culture and diversity. And while the theory was originally created to examine the muting of women's voices, one of the big applications that we'll be working through this week is really thinking about how the theory is going to help us understand the silencing process of any non-dominant group. Um, while the assumptions are going to be based off of sex and gender differences, I want you to keep in mind that this theory has a lot more applications than just looking at those differences. And I'm going to give you some highlights about that and ways to think about it. Just to go ahead and get us started thinking about muted group theory, essentially, what this theory is going to tell us is that language serves its creators better than those in other muted groups. So, we're specifically looking in this or in this theory about language acquisition, about language resources, and how people are able to describe the experiences that they are having. Ultimately, one of the things that we start to look at here is that for groups that are muted, so these non dominant groups, oftentimes they are going to appear to look less articulate because they are not using the language of the dominant group. And second, they're going to create their own language to try to experience what it is that what they have gone through. And that's really important because if these individuals do not have language that adequately talks about their own experience, that experience is going to either be ignored or it's not going to be understood. And we can even think about this from a cultural perspective that words exist in different cultures that explain experiences. And when somebody is learning a new language and they're trying to talk about their experience, they might have difficulty because there's not a word that would translate into the new language that they're learning. Same issue that we're going to be seeing with those who are in muted groups. If that language doesn't exist, the individuals are going to try to make their own explanations, their own language to try to experience and explain what they're going through. Just starting to think about the theory to get us understanding how language works. Language systems influence and limit ability to represent experiences. So, if language does not exist, if those symbols do not exist, people are not going to be able to fully articulate what they have gone through. And we're going to keep going into this idea even more. Language is limited in its ability to serve all members equally. We know that language creation is going to be connected to those dominant groups. You can think about this in terms of the amount of gendered language that we have within our system. If I say nurse, you probably immediately come to the idea of a female. If I say a firefighter, you are going to think of a male fighting fires. If I say post office worker, you probably think of male, police officer, things like that. If I say elementary school teacher, we know that within these words, we've really had to work to make them to be non-gender specific. Policeman versus policewoman. So we know that we actually have these gender tags built into language, which makes it really difficult to serve individuals. What this theory tries to do then is question the status quo. So it says, if we know that we can't talk about people's experiences, how are we going to fix this? One of the prime examples that started this research was specifically looking at research on women's birth experience. And what they found in the research was that the only explanations that they could find that talked about the female experience were written by male doctors. Clearly, this is problematic because it's not incorporating that experience that the woman had gone through at all, but instead was using the observations of what the male doctors had seen women going through. So women weren't really given the language to talk about their experiences. And until those words existed, things like postpartum depression, women were told that they shouldn't have these feelings, that these feelings didn't exist, and they were denied some of those treatments or those experiences or that support that they needed because of the lack of language to describe what it is that they were going through. Considering the beginnings of this theory, what the researchers found were that groups at the top of the social hierarchy determine the communication system. They are going to provide the language that we use to talk about the different experiences. And to to kind of support the point that I was just saying, the women's experiences were being studied by talking to men. So rather than getting a firsthand account from the individual, from this muted group, from this non-dominant group, instead, those experiences were coming from talking to men. Imagine if your student experience was only discovered and talked about and researched by incorporating what professors viewed. Your voice wouldn't be heard, your ideas wouldn't be heard. We'd have a really a good set of misinformation to try to help us understand this experience. All right. On this slide, the biggest thing that I want to talk about is going to be that the dominant group's language is a result of their worldview and experiences. The biggest problem that muted group theory is trying to help us understand is that if we only hear from this dominant group, this group that's in power, I want to bring that word in here right now, we're going to miss out on the experience of other people. An example that I can think of right now is that when we talk about the, let's say just the elementary school systems and children that are learning online from home right now. And I'll read an article that talks about how the system is going really great. The student has a set up place to do their homework. They've got a room dedicated as their school room. They've got computers to use. They've got other tools to use, iPads, lots of paper, pencils, crayons, things like that. They've got high-speed internet, so they are able to see the teacher. They're able to not have any glitches, Zoom freezing and things like that. Parents have the money to buy and purchase anything that the student might need, whether that be tutors, other materials, and things like that. If we were to do the same interview with a less power, a group that's not in power, let's say a group of parents and students that are of a lower socioeconomic status, they would probably have a lot of a different experience. They don't have access to a single room. Perhaps they don't have space in their house or their apartment that they can dedicate to the school experience. They don't have high speed internet. They don't have a brand new computer. They don't have access to all of these extra tools. If only the dominant group is creating this story that the online learning experience is going really great, we're clearly running into problems because only that group in power, they are muting the experience of those individuals that do not have that same access. The last thing that I want to point out on this slide, and comes out of that original research, was that the English language names concepts important to men but not women. Here you can go back to those ideas of using gender to explain careers, even the way that people are talked about. If a group of women get together, it's often said that they are going to get together to gossip, which is a negative word. Whereas if a group of men were getting together to have coffee, I wouldn't say, oh, those men are going to get together to gossip. So we can even see how this language has different power behind it, the way that we interpret these messages, and ultimately what that's going to mean for the dominant group, that group in power, compared to the groups that are not. All right, makeup of muted groups. Again, we've talked about this already, that most of the initial research was focused on women as a muted group, but really this applies to any non-dominant group. If you are a critical researcher, so let's go back to those first 3 chapters, this is going to be a theory that is important to you because you want to think about the language that's being used in your study that talks about this experience, what that's going to look like. An example that we had talked about previously in class was even looking at research that is on the homeless population. And a lot of individuals were saying that they don't want to be referred to as homeless, they want to be referred to as houseless, because the term home really refers to the community, the love that exists within inside that house. They found that within their community that they had been creating, what they didn't have was a house. So you can even see where that language, the way that these individuals are talked about, their preference is not going to be what the dominant group is using. The last difference to make here is just the differences between sex and gender. And I know that I am guilty of misusing these 2 words and using them interchangeably. When we're talking about sex, we're thinking about the biological perspective, whereas when we talk about gender, we're thinking about that masculinity, femininity, and we're thinking about what that looks like on a scale. So just keep that in mind as we're talking through these ideas and you're reading research on this topic, that we want to make sure that we're differentiating the differences between sex differences and gender differences. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the assumptions. Note that the assumptions are going to be gender based in their understanding because when this theory was created, it was specifically looking at gender. However, as the theory has evolved and as our application of it has evolved, the assumptions are still going to talk about gender, but we know that really we can talk about any non dominant group. The first assumption is going to be the gender based differences in perception. And this is understanding that men and women have different experiences and they're going to perceive the world differently because of that. A good example of this was even talking about how women had to work both the first shift and the second shift. And the idea was that working women would go in and put in a full day's work, and then they would come home and they would have a second shift job where they had to put together their house, take care of their husband and their children, do the cleaning, the cooking, the laundry, all of those types of things. So you can see where even in understanding these differences, those perceptions might look a little bit different between those two groups. The second assumption is going to be the dominance of men's system of perception. You can also just think about this as the dominance of the group in power's system of perception. We know that groups in power are going to dominate the political sphere. If you look at what you're seeing in the news, this is typically coming from dominant groups talking about the groups that are not in power. And that's a really important piece of information to keep in mind as you're reading and watching the news and groups of people that are not in power are being spoken about. Think about how the language is influencing you and how the conversation is influencing you because of some of the preferences in the power group's way to talk about that experience. The final one here, this just goes back to that original research of women's experiences being unnamed. Here's where that example of postpartum depression comes in. People couldn't understand, these male doctors didn't understand why women were suffering from depression and this really unhappy experience after they were giving birth. And part of it was because there wasn't a word to understand it. And to be completely frank, the idea that a male would be able to talk about what that personal experience is after a woman has given birth, clearly there's going to be a disconnect there because while they can do their research, they can't understand the hormones, the feelings, the emotions in the same way. So here's where that expression is going to become that those experiences remain unnamed and become really difficult to express if that non dominant group, in this case the women, aren't able to talk about their experience and have it be understood. The next assumption is going to be the woman's translation process. Again, you can translate this into any powerless or non dominant group. And one of the biggest things to come out of this was the idea that because the language is coming from this dominant group structure, it's not going to exist in the way that individuals need it to exist in. And so women in these non dominant groups will often use storytelling and they'll work to encode their process to try to create language, to create conversation about the experience that they are going through. And we've been seeing this a lot in politics right now. One of the examples that I can think of that I've seen recently was the meme that was going around about Kamala Harris, where she was saying, like, I'm speaking. And people were praising this meme to say like, yes, like listen to women. And then another group of a feminist group, I don't remember what it was, when they came back and they started saying, wait a minute, we shouldn't be telling women that they need to say I'm speaking, we should be teaching men to listen. And so even thinking about how the two different groups were able to think about this process and encode this experience in very different ways. And we'll continue to think about multiple examples where storytelling and this language, looking at it from two different sides, becomes really important. All right, the last example that I want to give here is going to be the process of silencing. And one of the biggest outcomes of this theory is that it's not just that the muted group doesn't have language, it's also going to be that they feel silenced and unable to talk through their experience. And part of this is going to be because of different reasons. Ridicule, being mocked or made fun of when they're sharing information, ritual, the fact that there might not be a space for these muted groups to even share their opinions or their ideas, control, if the dominant group is going to be the one that is controlling the narrative, they might choose to just not include any of the non dominant group information. And then finally, harassment. Sharing that information could result in really negative behaviors or actions towards that non dominant group that is trying to voice those opinions. So, hopefully, this gives you a little bit of an understanding of muted group theory, and we'll start thinking about how this works in a lot of different contexts. Definitely, we can think about from a social perspective what's happening within our own communities and where we can see this process of silencing. We can think about it in terms of politics, we can think about it in terms of movements, we can think about this in terms of education. There's a lot of different places where we start to see this process of silencing happening. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of an understanding to start thinking about the theory, and I look forward to going into it more in depth with you. Have a great rest